The air in the old colonial house of Clara's parents smelled of a bittersweet mixture of past and future. The scent of old wood and damp earth intertwined with the chemical, hopeful smell of fresh paint. For 25-year-old Clara, this was the aroma of her new life, one she tried to force into her lungs to expel the smell of hospital and funeral flowers that still haunted her memory, even a year later. Her long, wavy brown hair was tied in a loose bun, and a smudge of white paint decorated her cheek like a tear that had dried there. With a slender body and muscles defined by the heavy work of the renovation, she moved through the large house like a ghost, determined to haunt herself, to fill every room with sweat and effort so as not to leave space for grief. Every floorboard she tore up was a step away from the image of the twisted car. Every wall she sanded to exhaustion was an attempt to erase the coroner's cold words. Accident. It was a simple, clean word, but it didn't fit the complexity of her parents, people so full of life and plans. That's why Clara worked. She worked until her muscles ached more than her soul, until exhaustion knocked her into a dreamless sleep. On that day, the golden late afternoon light of Havenwood streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stars. Clara was on her knees, concentrating on fitting a piece of the new flooring, when the sound of knocking on the front door echoed through the empty house, startling her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her best friend Chloe knew not to come unannounced, and the rest of the town treated her with a distant delicacy, the kind of pity reserved for local tragedies. Hesitantly, she wiped her dusty hands on her jeans and walked to the door. As she opened it, the sun blinded her for a moment. When her eyes adjusted, the figure silhouetted against the light took shape. It was a tall man with broad shoulders under a simple grey t-shirt. His hair was dark and disheveled, and he had a stubble that gave him a charming and slightly wild look. But it was the eyes that held her. They were a deep, almost grey blue, and contained an intensity that made her feel completely exposed. "Sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice was deeper and softer than she expected. "I'm Ethan. I moved into the house next door. It seems my toolbox has decided to hide from me, and I'm in the middle of a battle with a bookshelf. Would you happen to have a wrench I could borrow?" Clara blinked, her mind taking a moment to process the simple question. She was so used to the silence that the interaction felt surreal. "Oh, sure, I think so." "One second." She turned and went to her father's toolbox, her heart beating erratically. The eye contact had only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to ignite something within her, a spark of curiosity she hadn't felt in a long time. When she returned with the tool, their hands brushed as she handed it to him. An electric current, brief but undeniable, passed between them. He smiled, a restrained smile that didn't quite reach his mysterious eyes. "Thanks. You're doing an incredible job here." His gaze went past her, assessing the interior of the house with genuine interest. "Saved by the neighbor. I owe you one." He turned to leave, and Clara stood there, frozen in the doorway, feeling the warmth where their hands had touched, watching him walk away. The silence that returned to fill the house no longer seemed so heavy. It now had a new note of expectation. Ethan returned the wrench the next morning, bringing with him 2 cups of steaming coffee that seemed to Clara the kindest gesture she had received in a year. From that day on, his presence became a gentle and welcome constant. He would show up with the pretext of having seen a loose beam or being curious about the house's history, but they both knew these were just excuses. He was a photographer, and his curious eyes seemed to want to capture more than just the architecture of the place. They wanted to capture her essence. Before long, he was helping her put up a drywall, and the sound of tools was often interrupted by the echo of their laughter, a sound Clara thought had died inside her. He was the opposite of grief. Where Clara's pain was a heavy silence, Ethan was an intriguing melody. He talked about the places he had photographed, from the vibrant colors of Morocco to the icy solitude of Iceland. But he was always vague about why he had chosen quiet Havenwood as his new home. "I was looking for something real," he would say, averting his gaze to his camera lens. He began to photograph her as she worked, capturing the strength in her arms, the concentration in her gaze, the golden dust in her hair. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like the town's poor orphan, but like a strong woman, a survivor. A part of her, a voice that sounded like guilt, whispered that it was too soon to feel happy. But Ethan's presence was like the sun after a long storm. It was impossible and illogical not to want to feel its warmth. Their connection deepened one warm summer evening. Sitting on the front porch, surrounded by the sound of crickets and the scent of jasmine, they shared a bottle of wine. The conversation flowed from trivialities to whispered confessions under the blanket of stars. Clara, feeling safe in a way she hadn't in a long time, talked about her parents. Not about their deaths, but about their lives. About how her father taught her to use a drill and how her mother planted the rose bushes that now grew wild in the garden. A silent tear escaped, and Ethan said nothing. He simply reached out, and with his thumb, dried her cheek with a gentleness that made her hold her breath. "They sounded like incredible people," he said, his voice a hoarse murmur. "I also know what it's like to lose everything and have to find a new direction." There was a pain in his eyes that mirrored hers, an abyss of secrets she felt an overwhelming desire to explore. In that moment, the tension that had vibrated between them since the first day became unbearable. He leaned in slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull back. She didn't. When their lips met, it was a sigh of relief, a recognition. It wasn't a kiss of overwhelming passion, but of deep connection, of two shipwrecked souls finding a safe harbor in each other. The taste of wine and new beginnings mixed in her mouth, and Clara allowed herself for the first time to believe that the empty house could, one day, become a home again. She just didn't know that the safe harbor she had just found was built on the ruins of a devastating lie. And it is in this rare moment of peace and hope that we take a short break. If you are feeling the strength of this connection and are anxious to discover what secret fate has in store for Clara and Ethan, don't forget to leave your like to support our work, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any detail of the twist that is to come. Now let's get back to the story, because the calm in Havenwood is about to be shaken by a storm. The following weeks unfolded like a dream. The house, once a mausoleum of memories, filled with life. Clara's project was almost complete, and the place had transformed into a welcoming home, with every corner reflecting the new hope she felt. Ethan was the center of this new universe. They cooked together in the newly renovated kitchen, the smell of garlic and basil replacing that of dust. He would surprise her with wildflowers picked on his photography walks, and at night they would sit on the porch and he would listen to her talk about her dreams for the future, dreams that now included him. Clara felt whole again, and the gratitude she felt for him was as overwhelming as her love. But happiness, she would learn, was a thin glass about to be shattered. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A book on design she had left in the living room appeared on her nightstand. She assumed Ethan had moved it. Then her mother's old music box, which she kept locked in a drawer, appeared open on the dresser. When she asked Ethan, he looked at her with genuine concern. "Honey, are you sure you didn't take it out? You've been exhausted with the renovation." Clara felt a chill. She knew she hadn't touched the box. Doubt began to eat away at the edge of her happiness. She started to feel an unsettling sensation, the impression that a pair of eyes was following her when she was alone in the house. The normal creaks of the old wood now sounded like furtive footsteps. Terror set in on a rainy afternoon. Clara was in her father's old office, organizing some documents, when she found something that shouldn't have been there. On top of a pile of architectural plans was a small photo of her parents, smiling during a picnic. It wasn't a photo she usually displayed. It belonged to an old album stored in the back of a trunk in the attic. Her blood ran cold. There was no way that picture could have gotten there by itself. Fear now had a face, and she found herself looking at Ethan with a suspicion that poisoned her. He was the only other person with unrestricted access to the house. Were these tasteless pranks, or something far more sinister? The truth, or what seemed to be it, hit her with the force of a car crash. That night while Ethan slept, anxiety wouldn't leave her alone. She needed answers. She remembered him mentioning that he had scanned some old photos for a project. With trembling hands, she opened his laptop, feeling like a traitor but driven by a primitive survival instinct. There was a folder named Personal Archive. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clicked, and there it was, a grainy image, dated a year ago from the day of the accident. It showed her parents' car parked at a scenic overlook, with them standing outside, laughing. But that wasn't what made her let out a choked sob. In the corner of the photo, partially hidden by the shadows of a tree, was a figure. And the angle of the photo, it wasn't from a security camera, it had been taken by someone who was there, watching. And then she saw the image file name, IMG Each Does 01. The initials, E.H. Ethan. The man sleeping in her bed was not her savior. He had been there. The sound of the laptop closing shut echoed in the silence of the room, startling Ethan awake. Clara was standing by the bed, her silhouette trembling against the dim moonlight. In her eyes, there was no longer love or passion. There was a hurricane of pain and betrayal. "I want you to explain what this is," she whispered, her voice broken but sharp as glass. "Now." Ethan's face, still hazy with sleep, turned pale when he saw her expression. He didn't need to ask what she was talking about. The truth he had hidden for so long had finally come to light. He sat up, running his hands over his face with a weariness that seemed to come from years, not a night's sleep. "Clara, I can explain. It's not what it looks like." But for her, the image of that photo was burned into her mind. "Not what it looks like," she repeated, her voice rising an octave, bordering on hysteria. "You were there. You were there the day they died. You lied to me. You came into my house, into my life." "Yes, I was there," he interrupted her, his voice firm but full of anguish. "I was following a lead that took me to that overlook that day. The same lead I've been following for 5 years, ever since my own parents died in an identical car accident." Clara's world stopped spinning. His words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Seeing the confusion on her face, Ethan got up and went to his camera gear bag. From a hidden compartment, he took out an old journal with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages. "This was my father's," he said, holding it out to her. "He was an engineer, just like yours, and they both worked on a project for a mutual friend, a doctor." He opened the journal to a marked page. "Read." With her hands still shaking, Clara took the journal. A stranger's handwriting detailed technical notes, but among them, one sentence stood out. "Wallace is pushing for the Omega results. He talks about the greater good, but there's something in his eyes, something that scares me. He has no limits." Wallace. Dr. Wallace, the family friend. The man who was like a second father to her after her parents' death, who comforted her, who managed the funeral, who advised her not to dwell on the past. The paternal and benevolent figure dissolved in her mind, replaced by a monster. "My parents. They wanted out of the project," Ethan whispered. his voice laden with an old pain. They thought Dr. Wallace was going too far, that the research was dangerous and unethical. A week later, their car went off the road. Clara looked from the journal page to Ethan's face. The photo on the laptop wasn't the proof of a murderer, but the only clue of a son desperate for answers, just like her. He wasn't the cause of her pain, but a mirror of it. The romance they had built might have been a lie, but the tragedy that united them was terrifyingly real. The ground had still vanished from under her feet, but now, in the darkness, she was no longer falling alone. There was someone else in the abyss with her. "What is the Omega Project?" she asked, her voice finally steady, no longer that of a victim, but of someone looking for a fight. The trust between Clara and Ethan was a fragile thread, but their shared determination was a steel cable. Guided by the journal's notes, they locked themselves in Clara's father's old office. While Ethan deciphered the chemical formulas, Clara used her expertise as a designer. She overlaid the original house plans with the renovations her father had made years before. That's when she noticed it. The east wall of the office was thicker on paper than in reality. There was a hollow space. Together they pushed, searched, and finally found the hidden mechanism. A bookshelf slid aside, revealing a small safe in the wall. Inside, a metal box contained the devastating truth, reports, samples, and a recorder. Clara's father's voice echoed from the device, detailing how the Omega Project was a neurotoxin capable of erasing specific memories, and how Dr. Wallace planned to sell it as a weapon to governments and criminal organizations. It was the proof they needed. As they left the house with the box, the feeling of being watched became a certainty. A dark car began to follow them through the streets of Havenwood. What followed was a desperate chase, with Ethan skillfully maneuvering through narrow alleys while Clara, her heart in her throat, sent digital copies of all the files to her friend Chloe, with instructions to release them to the press if she didn't receive a confirmation call within an hour. They managed to lose their pursuer, but they knew they couldn't run forever. They had to end this. The only option was to confront the monster in his lair. They went to Wallace's clinic, using the back entrance that Clara's father had designed years before. They found him in a secret, impeccably white laboratory in the basement, a place that contrasted with the darkness of his deeds. Dr. Wallace didn't seem surprised, but rather disappointed. "So clever, you two, just like your parents," he said, his voice calm and paternal, which made it all the more terrifying. They couldn't understand either. The Omega Project could cure trauma, erase pain. The world would call me a hero. He confessed everything with a cold arrogance, admitting to personally sabotaging their parents' cars to protect his legacy. When he moved forward, holding a syringe with a clear liquid, Ethan stood in front of Clara. "It's too late, Wallace," Clara said, her voice firm. "The press already has everything. The police are on their way." Wallace's face twisted in fury, but before he could react, the sound of sirens filled the silence, growing ever louder. He was finished. Months later, peace finally settled in Havenwood. The Omega Project scandal rocked the country, and Dr. Wallace would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Clara's house, once a monument to grief, was now a true home, bathed in sunlight. Her mother's rose bushes flourished in the garden, and the smell of fresh paint had been replaced by that of coffee. Clara and Ethan, standing on the porch, watched the sunset. The pain and betrayal had left scars, but instead of tearing them apart, the truth had united them in a way that love alone never could. They had rebuilt their trust brick by brick on the unshakable foundation of a shared tragedy, and justice won. He held her hand, and for the first time, the future didn't seem like an echo of a broken promise, but rather the blank page of a new story they would write together. If this story of betrayal, mystery and resilience touched you, don't leave without leaving your like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming plots. Comment below with the city you're watching from, activate the bell to be the first to know about new updates, and check out our channel. We have many other exciting stories waiting for you. Activate the bell to be the first to know about new updates and check out our channel. We have many other exciting stories waiting for you.